Welcome to the Archive of Nations series, scholars, warriors, and artisans. Thus far we have covered James Wells Parker, the activist who spoke on the African origins of civilization back in 1919. We have also covered Ms. Drusilla Houston, a somewhat forgotten female author who wrote about the black civilizations of the Indus River Valley, Ethiopia, the ancient Arabians, and the carbon organic civilizers of the Asiatic region, as well as the Peloponnese Peninsula, and final 3 videos covering the works of Cheikh Anta Diop. In this webisode, we focus on Oscar Micheaux, the prolific African-American producer and director who made films independently of the Hollywood film industry from the silent era until 1948. Between 1919 and 1948, he wrote, produced, directed, and distributed more than 45 films for African-American audiences who watched these race, all-black, films in the 700 theaters that were part of the ghetto circuit. Micheaux was one of the few black independents to survive the sound era, and he did so largely because of his tenacity, personal charisma, and talent for promoting his work. While on promotional tours, he used his completed films, which he often distributed by hand to waiting theaters, to secure from personal investors the financing for his next project. Micheaux's features emulated familiar Hollywood genres, and he used a modest version of the studio star system to lure audiences to his movies. His gangster films, Mysteries, and Jungle Adventures featured Lorenzo Tucker, called the Colored Valentino, Ethel Moses, the Black Harlow, and B. Freeman, the Sepia Mae West, among others. Despite Micheaux's understanding of certain Hollywood conventions, his films reveal a consciousness of race as a force in the lives of African Americans, and some deal directly with racial issues. These include his examination of white prejudice, Within Our Gates, 1920, Interracial Romance, The Exile, 1931, and skin tone issues within the African American community, God's Stepchildren, 1937. Micheaux's necessarily low budgets forced him to cut costs and resulted in technically inferior films with poor lighting, little editing, flubbed lines, continuity problems, and poor sound. Yet he treated issues that were important to his audience, offered an alternative to the stereotyping of blacks by Hollywood, and successfully operated outside the mainstream film industry during the powerful studio era. Netflix show Hollywood imagines an alternative history where a black filmmaker gets a shot at glory in an era when society tried to keep him down. The first episode is sure to mention one of the real-life cinematic pioneers who turned his own life story into big-screen history without bowing to Hollywood's prejudices, Oscar Micheaux. Today, films and TV shows like Hollywood, Black Panther, Black KK Klansman, and When They See Us break box office records and win awards for their depiction of African American fact and fantasy. It's a long way from cinema's beginnings a century ago, when race riots tore across America and the big screen was as segregated as the rest of the country. But one thing hasn't changed. Ryan Coogler, Spike Lee, and Ava DuVernay are among the black filmmakers keeping control of their stories by writing, directing, and producing them. In the early days of cinema, black creators also took on multiple roles in order to build their own alternative to Hollywood. And few did so more than Oscar Micheaux, the man who made 1919's The Homesteader, the first feature-length motion picture with an all-black cast. A self-taught, iconoclastic African-American filmmaker and maverick businessman, Micheaux's catalog of films from The Homesteader onwards unflinchingly tackled race, segregation, censorship, and other issues that still resonate 100 years later. Micheaux produced films challenging pre-existing views regarding race, explains film historian Charlene Register of the Oscar Micheaux Film Society, and demonstrated an audience existed which desired representations of black life on screen. The audacious and outspoken Micheaux was Muhammad Ali decades before his time, writes Patrick McGilligan in his book Oscar Micheaux, The Great and Only. Comparing him with lauded cinematic pioneer D.W. Griffith, McGilligan marvels that Micheaux's first 4 films alone earned his place as a stellar figure in American film. That legacy began more than 100 years ago with The Homesteader, but the seeds were sown much earlier in the dramatic true events of Micheaux's real life. Micheaux produced and directed 16 talkies, making him the only silent-era race picture luminary to cross over into the sound age. When the filmmaker Oscar Micheaux was born in 1884, in rural Illinois, movies barely existed. Micheaux had a deep understanding of the racial divide that blanketed the 19th century. Oscar Devereux Micheaux, born January 2, 1884 until March 25, 1951, was an American author, film director, and independent producer of more than 44 films. Although the short-lived Lincoln Motion Picture Company was the first movie company owned and controlled by black filmmakers, Micheaux is regarded as the first major African-American feature filmmaker, a prominent producer of race films, and has been described as the most successful African-American filmmaker of the first half of the 20th century. He produced both silent films and sound films. Micheaux was born on a farm in Metropolis, Illinois, on January 2, 1884. He was the fifth child born to Calvin S. and Belle Micheaux, who had a total of 13 children. In his later years, Micheaux added an E to his last name. His father was born in Kentucky. Because of his surname, it was possible he descended from French Huguenot refugees, which we will prove in our Fallacy of Greece and Rome series, were carbon organic tribes, families, and clans which had settled in Virginia in 1700. Their descendants took slaves west when they migrated into Kentucky after the American Revolutionary War. In his later years, Micheaux wrote about the social oppression he experienced as a young boy. His parents moved to the city so that the children could receive a better education. Micheaux attended a well-established school for several years before the family eventually ran into money troubles and were forced to return to the farm. The discontented Micheaux became rebellious, and his struggles caused problems within his family. His father was not happy with him and sent him away to do marketing in the city. Micheaux found pleasure in this job because he was able to speak to many new people and learn social skills that he would later reflect in his films. By the time he left home, at the age of 17, movies had progressed far beyond Edward Muybridge's Galloping Horses. Audiences were packing vaudeville houses to see the latest moving pictures, and Micheaux wanted to be a part of the emerging industry. When Micheaux was 17 years old, he moved to Chicago to live with his older brother, then working as a waiter. Micheaux became dissatisfied with what he viewed as his brother's way of living the good life. He rented his own place and found work in the stockyards, which he found difficult. He moved from the stockyards to the steel mills, holding down many different jobs. After being swindled out of $2 by an employment agency, Micheaux decided to become his own boss. His first business was a shoeshine stand, which he set up at a wealthy African-American barbershop away from Chicago competition. He learned the basic strategies of business and started to save money. He became a Pullman porter on the major railroads, at that time considered prestigious employment for African Americans because it was relatively stable, well paid, and secure, and it enabled travel and interaction with new people. This job was an informal education for Micheaux. He profited financially and also gained contacts and knowledge about the world through traveling, as well as a greater understanding for business. When he left the position, he had seen much of the United States, had a couple of $1,000s saved in his bank account, and had made a number of connections with wealthy white people who helped his future endeavors. Micheaux moved to Gregory County, South Dakota, where he bought land and worked as a homesteader farming South Dakota land the U.S. government had appropriated from Native Americans for a small filing fee to encourage Western expansion. Soon, Micheaux expanded his land holdings from 160 acres to well over 1,000 acres. His farm stood on the Rosebud Indian Reservation, a fitting name, as the dramatic events unfolding there shaped his entire life, just as the protagonist of Orson Welles' Citizen Kane was haunted by his infamous Rosebud. This experience inspired his first novels and films. His neighbors on the frontier were predominantly blue-collar whites. Some recall that Micheaux rarely sat at a table with his blue-collar white neighbors. Micheaux's years as a homesteader allowed him to learn more about human relations and farming. While farming, Micheaux wrote articles and submitted them to the press. The Chicago Defender published one of his earliest articles. Micheaux decided to concentrate on writing and, eventually, filmmaking, a new industry. He married a woman named Orlean McCracken but quarreled over money with her preacher father. Her family proved to be complex and burdensome for Micheaux. Unhappy with their living arrangements, Orlean felt that Micheaux did not pay enough attention to her. She gave birth while he was away on business and was reported to have emptied their bank accounts and fled. Orlean's father sold Micheaux's property and took the money from the sale. After his return, Micheaux tried unsuccessfully to get Orlean and his property back. With his marriage on thin ice and his farming facing a drought, Micheaux moved to Sioux City in 1913 and transformed himself into a novelist, penning the semi-autobiographical The Conquest, the story of a Negro pioneer in 1913, The Forged Note in 1915, and the fictionalized memoir The Homesteader in 1917, among others. The Homesteader was Micheaux's standout work of the era. This dispute, along with drought and debt, wiped out Micheaux's business. His homestead failed and he was forced to sell it in 1911. Undeterred, he wrote a novel based on the feud with his religious father-in-law. Micheaux sold his books door to door, garnering enough success to form his own publishing company, Western Book Supply. It was the solution to prejudicial publishing attitudes of the era, which had little interest in authentic accounts of the Black experience. He drew on his own life story to explore the African American experience, but the shrewd showman jazzed it up with romance, murder, a happy ending, and a provocative twist as the heroine turned out to be a Black woman passing for white. Nothing would make people more anxious to see a picture, he later noted, than a litho reading Shall the Races Intermarry? While in Sioux City, he lived in and was influenced by the West 7th Street neighborhood where the town's African American community had a strong presence. Segregation was a major cause of rioting when America exploded in the Red Summer of 1919. 38 people died in Chicago and hundreds more were killed and injured across the country. Movie-going was a very different experience for Black and white viewers, both in segregated theaters and in the films themselves. White producers and white stars controlled Hollywood, and white actors in blackface often played grotesquely racist colored characters. There were some all-Black films in the silent era. William Foster was the first Black director, with the short Keystone Cop-style comedy The Railroad Porter in 1912, while Luther Pollard's Ebony Film Corporation made all-Black, two-reel westerns, newsreels, and comedies collectively known as race pictures. The closest to a Black movie star was Noble Johnson, contracted to Universal Pictures but keen to produce films playing African American heroes. In 1918, his novel The Homesteader, dedicated to his mother, attracted the attention of George Johnson, the manager of the Lincoln Motion Picture Company in Los Angeles. He courted Micheaux in the hope of adapting The Homesteader into a film, but Johnson's Hollywood bosses nixed the deal. After Johnson offered to make The Homesteader into a new feature film, negotiations and paperwork became inharmonious. Micheaux wanted to be directly involved in the adaptation of his book as a movie, but Johnson resisted and never produced the film. So Micheaux decided to go it alone. Micheaux founded the Micheaux Film and Book Company of Sioux City. Its first project was the production of The Homesteader as a feature film. Micheaux's first novel, The Conquest, was eventually adapted to film and retitled The Homesteader. This film, which met with critical and commercial success, was released in 1919. It revolves around a man named Jean-Baptiste, called the Homesteader, who falls in love with many white women but resists marrying one out of his loyalty to his race. Baptiste sacrifices love to be a key symbol for his fellow African Americans. He looks for love among his own people and marries an African American woman. Relations between them deteriorate. Eventually, Baptiste is not allowed to see his wife. She kills her father for keeping them apart and commits suicide. Baptiste is accused of the crime, but is ultimately cleared. An old love helps him through his troubles. After he learns that she is a mulatto and thus part African, they marry. This film deals extensively with race relationships. Within a few months, Micheaux raced into production. Ignoring the burgeoning Los Angeles movie industry, he recruited East Coast and Midwest stage actors, vaudevillians, and musicians. For the character based on his ill-fated wife Orlean, Micheaux spotted 21-year-old Evelyn Prieur preaching on a street corner. Prieur became Micheaux's leading lady throughout his career, earning the nickname the Colored Queen of Cinema. Micheaux raced out to Iowa cornfields to film The Harvest before he'd even finished the script. He worked so fast the whirlwind production was completed by Christmas 1918. It cost $15,000, a fraction of the cost of a Hollywood production, but still an unheard of amount for a race picture. And it was 2.5 hours long. Even Charlie Chaplin didn't make a feature-length picture until 2 years later. Micheaux was working outside Hollywood, but his ambition was more than a match. Micheaux contacted wealthy academic connections from his earlier career as a porter and sold stock for his company at $75 to $100 a share. Micheaux hired actors and actresses and decided to have the premiere in Chicago. The film and Micheaux received high praise from film critics. One article credited Micheaux with a historic breakthrough, a creditable, dignified achievement. Some members of the Chicago clergy criticized the film as libelous. The Homesteader became known as Micheaux's breakout film. It helped him become widely known as a writer and a filmmaker. The Homesteader premiered February 20th, 1919, to a packed 8,000-seat theater in Chicago. An opera singer, jazz musicians, and a newsreel about African-American infantry unit the Illinois Black Devils played before the screening. The Homesteader was advertised as a new epic in the achievements of the darker races. And the audience loved it. Reviews were positive, but it's hard to know exactly how close Micheaux hewed to his own source material. The 100-year-old film hasn't survived, a recurring problem in a time when film preservation wasn't on anyone's mind. Among the rave reviews from the time, Half Century magazine said, "Many scenes rank in power and workmanship with the greatest of white Western productions." It was immediately banned, thanks to the scheming of Micheaux's real-life nemesis, the father of his deceased wife. But Micheaux fought back, and thousands more people crammed into screenings at Chicago's most prestigious black theater, the Vendome. Micheaux then hit the road, personally lugging the film print to theaters across the Midwest and South. Micheaux's movies featured predominantly black casts, playing characters that pushed back against the cruel caricatures of Black Americans seen in popular films like The Birth of a Nation. Working out of his own independent company on a shoestring budget, Micheaux gave his characters a dignity and humanity that was rarely seen on screens at the time. He presented an unflinching look at the legacy of white supremacy in America with his famous, and, at the time, controversial, film Within Our Gates. Micheaux's second silent film was Within Our Gates, produced in 1920. Although sometimes considered his response to the film The Birth of a Nation, Micheaux said that he created it independently as a response to the widespread social instability following World War I. Within Our Gates revolved around the main character, Sylvia Landry, a mixed-race school teacher played by actress Evelyn Preer. In a flashback, Sylvia is shown growing up as the adopted daughter of a sharecropper. When her father confronts their white landlord over money, a fight ensues. The landlord is shot by another white man, but Sylvia's adoptive father is accused and lynched with her adoptive mother. Sylvia is almost raped by the landowner's brother, but discovers that he is her biological father. Micheaux always depicts African Americans as being serious and reaching for higher education. Before the flashback scene, we see that Sylvia travels to Boston, seeking funding for her school, which serves black children. They are underserved by the segregated society. On her journey, she is hit by the car of a rich white woman. Learning about Landry's cause, the woman decides to give her school $50,000. In the film, Micheaux depicts educated and professional people in black society as light-skinned, representing the elite status of some of the mixed-race people who comprised the majority of African Americans freed before the Civil War. Poor people are represented as dark-skinned and with more undiluted African ancestry. Mixed-race people also feature as some of the villains. The film is set within the Jim Crow era. It contrasted the experiences for African Americans who stayed in rural areas and others who had migrated to cities and become urbanized. Micheaux explored the suffering of African Americans in the present day, without explaining how the situation arose in history. Some feared that this film would cause even more unrest within society, and others believed it would open the public's eyes to the unjust treatment of blacks by whites. Protests against the film continued until the day it was released. Because of its controversial status, the film was banned from some theaters. The film's frank depiction of racism, including a lynching, was meant as a counterbalance to the sanitized version seen in director D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, 1915. Following the Chicago race riot of 1919, local ministers believed the anti-lynching sentiment would stir up further aggression and asked him not to show it. Micheaux ignored them, and audiences lined up. Micheaux's work belonged to a category of movies simply known as race films. Made roughly between the late 1910s and late 1940s, these films were made for black audiences by black filmmakers and actors. They hit their peak in the 1920s, when more than 30 companies were making race films and tackled issues specific to their audience. These included the politics of skin color within the black community, gender differences, class differences, and regional differences, especially during this period of the Great Migration, according to film professor and TCM host Jacqueline Stewart. Certain race films resembled the middle-class melodramas that are commonly associated with classic Hollywood today. That was part of what made them so revolutionary. They placed black characters in the same situations as white stars like Mary Pickford or Greta Garbo. They also offered an alternative to the racist stock characters that had become the default roles for black actors in the studio system. These roles, the film scholar Richard Gruppenhoff notes, included the shiftless fool, the brute, the comic female pickaninny, the faithful servant, the unfortunate servant, and the wise old mammy. These stereotypes, Gruppenhoff argues, reflected prevailing assumptions among white society that black Americans were less intelligent, less self-sufficient, or less human. Micheaux's films were made during a time of great change in the African American community. His films featured contemporary black life. He dealt with racial relationships between blacks and whites, and the challenges for blacks when trying to achieve success in the larger society. His films were used to oppose and discuss the racial injustice that African Americans received. Topics such as lynching, job discrimination, rape, mob violence, and economic exploitation were depicted in his films. These films also reflect his ideologies and autobiographical experiences. Micheaux sought to create films that would counter negative portrayals of African Americans in films by white producers, which trafficked in degrading stereotypes. He created complex characters of different classes. His films questioned the value system of both African American and Euro-American societies, which stirred controversy with the press and state censors. Critic Barbara Lupac described Micheaux as pursuing moderation with his films and creating a middle-class cinema. His works were designed to appeal to both middle and lower-class audiences. Micheaux said, "My results might have been narrow at times, due perhaps to certain limited situations, which I endeavored to portray, but in those limited situations, the truth was the predominant characteristic. It is only by presenting those portions of the race portrayed in my pictures, in the light and background of their true state, that we can raise our people to greater heights. I am too imbued with the spirit of Booker T. Washington to engraft false virtues upon ourselves, to make ourselves that which we are not." For his next film after The Homesteader, Micheaux took aim at the controversial epic Birth of a Nation, which depicted the Ku Klux Klan as heroes. One of the worst offenders in this regard was, of course, The Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith's racist revisionist history of the Civil War and Reconstruction era. The film notoriously portrayed the Ku Klux Klan as crusading heroes, defending the virtue of white women against black sexual predators, who were played by white actors in blackface. The Birth of a Nation is often credited with reviving the KKK and was linked to several instances of violence against black communities following its 1915 release. Sensing its awful potential, activists, most notably William M. Trotter, tried to get the movie banned, but to no avail. The Birth of a Nation was a hit. The most dangerous thing about Birth of a Nation was its huge financial success, filmmaker Reginald Hudlin says in Birth of a Movement, the PBS documentary about the Trotters campaign. Because at the end of the day, Hollywood works on precedent. Whether people know better or not, they're going to go back to tropes that they feel are associated with success. You have Birth of a Nation, which is very successful, and you go, okay, America loves racism. They will pay money to see racism on screen. Within Our Gates turned D.W. Griffith's hatefully racist storyline on its head by depicting Evelyn Prier's character brutalized by white oppressors. Micheaux was incredibly audacious, says film historian Register, by suggesting that where Griffith depicts blacks as terrorizing, the real terrorizers from Micheaux's perspective are whites who sexually assault black women. A movie poster for Micheaux's 1939 drama Birthright, a talkie remake of his own earlier silent film in which a Harvard graduate returns to his southern hometown to open an industrial training school for African Americans but faces a racist white banker. Most of Micheaux's films were out of the norm for Hollywood at the time, which largely ignored black audiences. Theaters were usually segregated, with black audience members relegated to the balcony. Within Our Gates survives today, and you can even watch it on YouTube. McGilligan, the Micheaux biography author, calls the film an astutely written, at times beautifully directed, landmark. It was quickly banned in the South. Race films were an attempt to balance this bigotry. Gruppenhoff writes that civil rights leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois came to advocate not for blacks to condemn the birth of a nation's shortcomings, but rather to create a film aesthetic of their own. If the major studios weren't going to take their concerns seriously, they would make the movies they wanted to see themselves. White discrimination was, paradoxically, one of the causes for the rise of independent black filmmaking, Gruppenhoff writes. Micheaux was one of the most prolific filmmakers to respond to this call. He wrote, directed, and produced approximately 40 features over the course of 3 decades. His first film, made with the black production company Lincoln Motion Picture Company, was an adaptation of his semi-autobiographical novel The Homesteader. But his second film, Within Our Gates, engaged with the birth of a nation quite directly. This is most noticeable in an extended flashback sequence, which sees the movie's heroine, a black schoolteacher named Sylvia, running from an angry white mob. They are mistakenly convinced her adoptive father Jasper Landry, a poor black man, killed his rich white landlord. In retribution, they lynch both Landry and his wife and nearly murder their young son Emile. While all this is happening, the landlord's brother finds Sylvia and attempts to rape her, before realizing she is his biracial daughter. This sequence offers a more accurate version of American history, casting innocent black families as the victims of senseless violence from racist mobs and black women as the targets of sexual assault, rather than suggesting that white damsels were the real victims of Reconstruction. As the film scholar Anna Siamopoulos notes, Micheaux even counters the birth of a nation in the politics of its aesthetics by using editing techniques parallel to those that Griffith employed in his film, offering much more than the very simple opposition between white virtue and black villainy. Unlike The Birth of a Nation, Within Our Gates was banned or censored in some cities over fears of racial unrest. It was also, for many decades, considered a lost film, one of the many silent movies that were carelessly destroyed or left to languish in an unknown storage unit. But a single print was later found in Spain and preserved by the Library of Congress in 1993. According to the LOC, Within Our Gates is now considered the earliest known surviving feature directed by an African American, making it, by extension, one of the oldest surviving rebuttals to the racism of Griffith's film. Most of Micheaux's films were out of the norm for Hollywood at the time, which largely ignored black audiences. Theaters were usually segregated, with black audience members relegated to the balcony. A Micheaux film would pack all black movie houses, with Micheaux himself often approaching theater owners directly to book his movies. Although the films were modestly budgeted at around $10,000 to $20,000 apiece and often successful, Micheaux was in a constant state of uncertainty over finances. This impacted the quality of his films. Micheaux sometimes opted to use the first good take or even shoot at his second wife Alice's family home in Montclair, New Jersey. Funds were raised by selling stocks or promising investors they could put their children in his films. Owing to his limited budgets, many of his actors were amateurs rather than professionals. Unfortunately, black filmgoers only paid between 10 and 25 cents for a ticket, much less than the big city white viewers who laid out $1 or $3. And despite Micheaux's hopes that the film would cross over, white audiences simply wouldn't watch race pictures. Meanwhile, a brief mention of abortion in The Homesteader caused censors to order the whole scene cut. Censorship dogged Micheaux throughout his career. His later film Body and Soul, starring Paul Robeson, had 4 of the 9 reels cut by authorities. But Micheaux gave as good as he got, exploiting loopholes and occasionally straight-up cheating. He once put a different title on a movie print and snuck it into Virginia theaters before authorities got wise. And he drew on these experiences to write the 1923 film Deceit, a story about censorship. Every alteration by censors meant the physical film strip itself was hacked up and the prints simply fell apart. You can still see rare and significant films made by Micheaux and other black filmmakers in the BFI's Pioneers of African American Cinema DVD and Blu-ray box set, but most of Micheaux's 44 films are lost to us, including The Homesteader. For the next 3 decades, Micheaux turned out movies at a prodigious rate. Although he wasn't considered cool by the standards of the Harlem Renaissance artistic movement of the 1920s, he often tackled social issues while keeping an eye on commercial prospects. Today, he's remembered as a pioneer of African American cinema, including a recent tribute in the opening episode of HBO's Watchmen. He also returned to the real-life incidents depicted in The Homesteader again and again. The year 1986 was a critical one for black voices in cinema, and not simply because director Spike Lee made his directorial debut with She's Gotta Have It. It was also the year the Directors Guild of America bestowed a Golden Jubilee Special Directorial Award on late filmmaker Oscar Micheaux, an important but often overlooked pioneer in the earliest days of the movies. In fact, Micheaux stands as one of the most successful independent filmmakers of any era. Over the course of his career, he produced more than 40 feature films, many of them centered around themes of social activism, civil rights, and interracial relationships at a time they were barely being represented in film, and he did it all without the backing of a major studio. An Oscar Micheaux production was just that, a creation conceived and realized by one of history's earliest black filmmakers. But having such ambitions carried no shortage of obstacles. In 1925's Body and Soul, a priest, played by Paul Robeson, who would star in many of Micheaux's films, struggles with his corrupted faith, which put censors on edge. They declared the movie sacrilegious, immoral, and that it would tend to incite violence. Micheaux was forced to edit it. In 1935's Murder in Harlem, Micheaux himself appears as a detective involved in a murder that prejudiced white police have blamed on a black man. The attorney who helps clear the man's name got through law school by selling books door to door, a nod to Micheaux's own past. Micheaux's first talkie, The Exile, even added song and dance numbers. This lavish 1931 film won Micheaux another milestone for black cinema, the first full-length sound feature with a black cast. The fact he was able to make as many films as he did over a 30-year span would make him noteworthy in and of itself, says film historian Jeff Hinkleman. That those films provide us with an invaluable window into racial concerns across that time frame gives the man and his work incalculable significance. As silent movies gave way to talkies, Micheaux continued working, but the rough edges of his low-budget films became more pronounced as studios sunk the bulk of their funding into lavish productions and offered token roles to black performers. The financial struggle eventually ended Micheaux's film career, but not before he made one final splash with The Betrayal, a 1948 film where, once more, a black rancher, Leroy Collins, falls for a multiracial woman, Myra Stanton. The Betrayal was budgeted at $100,000, a rich sum for the time. With a running time of 3.5 hours, it was a tough sell to exhibitors, so Micheaux suggested they split it up into 3 movies. Although it was tepidly received, it became the first film with an all-black cast to premiere in a Broadway-area theater in New York City. The Betrayal was yet another retelling of the incident on the Rosebud Reservation homesteads. Like Citizen Kane, Micheaux couldn't let go of Rosebud. Even at the end of his life, he was still the homesteader. Financial hardships during the Great Depression eventually made it impossible for Micheaux to keep producing films, and he returned to writing. He spent his remaining years writing books until his death from undisclosed causes at age 67 on March 25, 1951. I like to think he died incorrigible and undaunted, says J. Ronald Green in his book With a Crooked Lick, the films of Oscar Micheaux, not only writing himself into history but irreverently and optimistically rewriting the stories of America. In part because only a fraction of his films survived, less than 12 altogether, recognition was slow in coming for Micheaux. More than 30 years passed between his death in 1951 and the 1986 Directors Guild Award. There are signs that might be changing. In 2010, the U.S. Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp in his honor, and in 2019, the Library of Congress selected 1925's body and soul for preservation owing to its cultural significance. They did the same in 1993 for Within Our Gates, which was discovered after having been tucked away in a Spanish vault since 1979. Filmmaker Tyler Perry is planning on making an HBO Max series about Micheaux's life. There are continued calls for the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences to pay tribute to Micheaux, who was not only a pioneer of black cinema, but cinema as a whole. Had it not been for an Oscar Micheaux, there certainly couldn't be a Tyler Perry, Perry told Variety in 2020. While history may have needed to catch up to Micheaux's achievements, his contemporaries did not. He is buried in Great Bend Cemetery in Great Bend, Kansas, the home of his youth. On Micheaux's tombstone reads a simple inscription, "A man ahead of his time."